I found myself in the middle of a terrifying situation at school, where a shooting occurred, and tragically, one of my classmates lost their life. However, the entire incident turned out to be a prank, and I suspect my brother might have been behind it all. It all started while I was sitting in my engineering lecture when the deafening sound of a shotgun blast echoed from outside the building, throwing everyone into a state of panic. Instinctively, I ducked under my desk, and I saw about 5 or 6 students sprinting toward a large metal structure at the front of the room, desperate to find cover. All of them managed to squeeze behind it, except for one, a frail, small student who was shoved out by the others. Exposed and vulnerable, he tried to push his way under the professor's desk for protection, but our professor, insisting there was only enough room for one, also pushed him away. The student froze, standing there in the open, petrified and motionless for what felt like an eternity, 20 seconds at least. Then, suddenly, he clutched his chest and collapsed to the floor, gripped by a fear-induced heart attack. No one dared to rush to his aid. We were all too afraid to risk our own lives. We watched in horror as he passed away. At that moment, the shooter was still outside. As selfish as it sounds, the only thing on my mind was the need to stay still, stay quiet, and avoid drawing any attention to myself. My body shook uncontrollably under the desk, and it felt as though the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me. My thoughts raced. What if the shooter came into our classroom next? I struggled to control my breathing, but it was incredibly difficult. I could hear other students around me, crying softly and whispering prayers. Minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. As I crouched under the desk, trying to hold on to my sanity, my phone suddenly erupted with notifications in my pocket, the same as everyone else's. The room filled with the buzzing of countless phones. I pulled mine out and glanced at the screen, where a flood of messages awaited me, texts from friends, classmates, and even my parents. The first was from my roommate, asking if I was okay because she'd heard there was a shooter on campus. Another message, from a classmate I barely knew, warned me to stay inside. Then, there was a text from my mom, which hit me like a ton of bricks. Please tell me you're okay. There's a shooter at your school. I'm so scared. Please call me as soon as you can. Everyone was saying the shooter was near the humanities building, the very building we were in. I looked around the room and saw the same fear etched on everyone's faces. We were all huddled under our desks, eyes glued to our phones. Some were frantically texting their families to let them know they were okay, while others were paralyzed by fear. I quickly texted my mom back, assuring her that I was safe and would call her as soon as possible. Eventually, the wail of sirens filled the air, signaling the arrival of campus security and the police. I could hear them shouting, their footsteps reverberating through the hallways as they methodically cleared each room. When they finally reached our classroom, the wave of relief that washed over me was so overwhelming that I nearly cried. They gave us the all clear, assuring us it was safe to come out from under our desks. My legs trembled as I stood, feeling as though they were made of jelly. We all stumbled out into the hallway, which was a chaotic scene. Students were everywhere, some in tears, others staring blankly into space. It took a while for the police to explain what had actually happened. There was no shooter. The 2 gunshots we heard had been an accidental discharge by a campus security officer responding to a false report. But by then, the damage had already been done. Our classmate was dead, and the entire campus was in a state of shock. As soon as I could, I pulled out my phone and texted my brother Mark. He's also a student at the same university, and I desperately needed to make sure he was okay. The seconds it took for him to reply felt like an eternity, but when his response finally came, I could breathe again. He was fine, locked down in another building, and he asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, but the truth was, I wasn't. I don't think anyone on campus was fine after what had just happened. I had just watched my classmate die right in front of me. That night, I went to Mark's apartment. I needed to see him, to reassure myself that he was truly okay. When I arrived, I expected him to be as shaken up as I was. I thought we would sit down and talk about what had happened. But when he opened the door, Something about him was different, eerily calm. He greeted me as if nothing was out of the ordinary, and when I asked if he was okay, he simply said that he was fine. I followed him into the apartment and immediately noticed that it was a mess, which was unusual for Mark. He was usually pretty tidy, but now empty coffee cups and scattered papers littered the space. It looked as though he hadn't been taking care of himself, but he didn't seem to care. We sat down, and I tried to talk to him about the events of the day, but every time I brought it up, he deflected the conversation. Every time I tried to bring up the incident, Mark would change the subject or give me some vague, non-committal answer that didn't really explain anything. It was frustrating, but I didn't want to push him too hard. I figured maybe he was dealing with it in his own way and just needed some space. But as the days went by, things only got stranger. Mark became increasingly secretive. He'd leave the room to take phone calls, and when I asked who he was talking to, he'd just shrug and say it was no one important. He also started avoiding certain parts of campus, especially the area where the incident had occurred, even though he had a class in the humanities building twice a week. Every time I tried to ask him about it, he'd brush me off or get defensive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. It was as if he was hiding something from me, and I hated it. Mark and I had always been close, never keeping secrets from each other, so I couldn't understand why he was acting like this now. One night, I heard him talking on the phone late, and I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was going on. I crept down the hallway as quietly as possible and pressed my ear against his bedroom door. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he'd hear it. I strained to make out what he was saying, but his voice was muffled. I only caught bits and pieces, but then, clear as day, I heard 3 words that sent chills down my spine. Wasn't supposed to. I froze, trying to process what I had just heard. Wasn't supposed to what? I thought of all the possibilities, and none of them were good. I didn't dare stick around to hear more. I quickly tiptoed back down the hall, threw myself onto the living room couch, and turned on the TV, pretending I'd been watching it the whole time. A few moments later, I heard Mark hang up the phone. He walked into the living room, and I forced myself to act natural, but inside, I was freaking out, trying to piece together what those 3 words could possibly mean. Suspicion started to gnaw at me. I knew something was going on, and I was determined to find out what it was. I started digging around, talking to people who knew him, trying to figure out what he was up to. It didn't take long before I discovered something that made my stomach drop. Mark had been spending a lot of time with a group of students notorious for pulling extreme pranks. These weren't the harmless, funny kind. They were dangerous, the type that could get people seriously hurt. The more I found out, the worse it got. I couldn't believe that Mark would get involved with people like that, but the evidence was piling up. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I had a gut feeling that this group had something to do with what happened on campus that day. I tried to confront Mark about it, but he just became more defensive and evasive. It was like he had become a completely different person, and I didn't know what to do. Then, one night, I decided I needed answers. I went to his apartment again, determined to find out the truth. When I got there, as I approached Mark's apartment, I could hear voices coming from inside. Mark was arguing with someone, and they had no idea I was just outside the door, listening. What I overheard made my blood run cold. They were talking about the incident, the one that had shaken the entire campus. It was supposed to be a prank, they said. They had staged the whole active shooter scenario as a joke, thinking it would be funny to cause chaos on campus. But things spiraled out of control when a campus security officer fired his gun, and Ryan had a heart attack. They never meant for it to go that far. But now someone was dead. I stood there, stunned, struggling to comprehend what I was hearing. My own brother had been involved in something that led to someone's death. I felt like I was going to be sick. A part of me wanted to burst into the room and confront him right then and there, but another part of me was too paralyzed to move. I waited until the other student left before I walked in. When Mark saw me, his face turned pale. He knew instantly that I had heard everything. I didn't waste any time. I demanded to know what the hell he had done and what was going on. He tried to explain, to justify it, but nothing he said made it any better. He kept insisting that it was just supposed to be a prank, that they never meant for anyone to get hurt. But that didn't change the fact that someone had died because of what they did. My classmate was dead, and Mark was partly to blame. I was furious, but more than that, I was heartbroken. I had always looked up to Mark growing up. He was the kid everyone admired, the one who always did the right thing, even when no one was watching. He was the kind of person who would stand up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it meant putting himself on the line. But now, it was like I didn't even know him anymore. Somewhere along the line, something had changed. I was torn. Part of me wanted to protect him because he's my brother and I love him, but another part of me knew that I couldn't let this go. What he did was unforgivable, and I knew that if I stayed silent, I would be just as guilty as he was. My classmate's family deserved justice, and the truth needed to come out, no matter how much it hurt. After many sleepless nights and agonizing over what to do, I made the hardest decision of my life. I went to the authorities and told them everything I knew. It felt like a piece of me was being ripped out, but I knew I had to do it. I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent. The fallout was brutal. Mark was expelled from the university, along with the other students involved in the prank. Some of them were even charged with criminal offenses. The campus was rocked by the scandal, and my family was devastated. My parents were furious with me. They couldn't understand why I'd turned in my own brother. They blamed me for ruining his life. Now, my family is torn apart. Mark won't speak to me, and my parents barely look at me. I've never felt so alone in my life. I keep asking myself if I did the right thing, but deep down, I know I did. Ryan didn't deserve to die, and I couldn't let Mark get away with what he did. But it's still so hard to know that I'm the one who tore my family apart. I've tried to keep going, focusing on my studies and moving forward. But it's not easy. Everywhere I go on campus, I feel like people are whispering about me, like they know what I did. It feels like the backlash from the incident has landed squarely on my shoulders, and I'm being punished more than Mark ever was. I've become an outcast. I try not to let it get to me. I keep reminding myself that what I did was the right thing, even if it doesn't always feel like it. I haven't spoken to Mark since he left campus. I don't know where he is or what he's doing now, and honestly, I'm too scared to reach out. I'm terrified that he hates me, that he'll never forgive me for what I did. I keep telling myself that time will heal everything, and that eventually, my family will come around and understand why I did what I did. But right now, that feels like a distant dream. It's been almost a year since I last spoke to Mark, and I just found out that he has been sentenced to 4 years in prison. I learned this from my mother, who called to tell me what a terrible sister I am, and that if I had just kept my mouth shut, her son would still be a free man. It hurt a lot to hear that, and I just hung up on her without saying anything. I'm trying to deal with all of this, but it's overwhelming.